Hello, everyone. I am here with Massimo, and we're going to be talking about work stress and how it impacts men and how it impacts their sexuality, their relationship to their sexual selves, and their relationships with others. And I really wanted to have this conversation because it's coming up a lot more with men that I'm working with. This work pressure, and it's really impacting their relationships that they are in, and it's impacting their relationships themselves and how often they are, masturbating or being intimate with themselves as well as their partners. So I really wanted to speak to this because I am guessing there is a lot of men out there, and if you're watching this, then please stay tuned in because we really want to speak to this, myself and Massimo, so that men can hear, and that's why I've invited you, Massimo, because you're a man. And originally I was going to just talk about it myself. And so I'll just share how I came across your work briefly before we get into the conversation. So I watched an interview with Massimo on on Instagram, and I was really struck, Massimo, by the way that you were giving different suggestions of how couples could bring up their sexual needs and desires, and how nuanced that conversation, how nuanced the approach is, how there's lots of different ways men or women or people can bring up with their partners how there's something that they'd really like to try out. And just really, really enjoyed the interview with you and David. So I was like, oh, wow. And then I read your blog. It was just perfect timing. And you wrote this blog. So your blog, The Male Dilemma, is what you wrote. And underneath it, you said, a need to evolve in work and success, about how men are, there's this issue with men lagging behind in real evolution in their sexual self-image. So I read your article, your blog article, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect timing. This is what I want to speak to. So I invited you to have a conversation with me. So that's what we're going to be speaking to, myself and Massimo. So just to introduce Massimo, who I've just myself met a couple of weeks ago, and I've really been enjoying your content so much. I've been following you on Instagram. So Massimo is a sexologist, a psychological therapist, a sex therapist, a sex coach. So you have a lot of experience, and you've been doing this for a long time.
I have. It's been about 17 years now.
Yes.
So it's a field that's really cool to me. I know psychotherapy and psychological therapy as well, but the sex side I think is fundamental to how I practice, and it's really the cornerstone, really.
Yes, and we can speak a bit more about that in how it's a part of men's lives which men seem to, for various different reasons, not be feeling in connection with at the moment, whether it's due to what's going on globally or it's actually a long running pattern for men. So what I've noticed with the men is, and this taps into like male social conditioning around performance, achievement, being work focused. And the men that I'm working with, they're coming to me and they're working 60, 70, maybe even 80-hour weeks. And then they're coming home and they are exhausted. They are completely wiped. And they are then ruminating for the very little free time they have for the rest of the evening, or they are continuing to do work. So they're finishing work and they're actually continuing right up until bedtime. So they're exhausted. They don't feel like masturbating, self-pleasuring. They don't feel like being intimate with their partners. And so they come to me wanting to reconnect with that part of themselves. So I'm really curious, in your work and with the men that you work with, is this a similar pattern that you're noticing as well?
Well, I mean, I think it's always been a pattern with most men, because I think, look, I think if you have a guy who's quite balanced in the way that they see their life, and they go, okay, there's a certain focus that I can give to my work, but then there's also the expectation that I have from my relationship. They're probably more able to sort of balance things out a little bit. And I think the more conscious we become as men, which is a great movement at the moment, because I'm seeing a lot more traction in that side, and it's necessary, because I think the beauty of femininity is that all the ladies are really advancing at a rate of knots, and I hope we can catch up as well, but be something different. And I'm glad that you kind of brought up this topic of stress in work, because I guess if I reflect back to myself in moments where I have been working 70, 80 hours, where you're trying to build a business, and you're very
Yeah.
much focused on all these things. And I guess it beckons more the question of how that stress unfolds in the man, because like you're pointing out, is there a decrease in the need to masturbate? Is there a decrease in the desire to actually want to have sex with a partner? There's a lot of sort of very different nuances in terms of how men relate to it. I think one of the key things when there is a lot of stress involved is an increase in masturbation,
Yes.
because it's far easier for a man to go, look, let me spend 5, 7, however well you've mastered it, minutes, with myself, get that release, go to sleep, call it a day, and start again. Um, the problem comes in when there's the expectation from the partner, or when they're trying to perform as equally well as they're doing in work in a sexual relationship as well. And I think there's usually a disconnect with the body here, where, I mean, if you're thinking about, let's say, for instance, guys who are very high flyers,
Yes.
what do? Usually they're training a lot. So training physically as well. So they think in their minds, okay, work is going great, invest all the time in work, invest time in my body in terms of training. But they're forgetting one fundamental here, that it's actually causing more inflammation in the body.
Ah, yes.
Now, if you're thinking about what stress actually does, stress induces cortisol, cortisol induces inflammation in the body. And the second there is all this release of cortisol in the body, for men in particular, called it the stress hormone, you've got problems. And this is where I think guys really need to start learning to be a lot more mindful in how they're choosing to live their lives. Because in hindsight, I was like that. And when you're feeling that cortisol in your body all the time, and you know that you're stressed, it's just, we palm it off as almost something like, it's just stress, it doesn't mean anything. Whereas in actual fact, if you have this constant inflammation going on in the body, you can't expect yourself to perform either.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. I hadn't even thought of it like that. And I'm so into the whole inflammation in the body and how our biochemistry and stress chemicals is actually impacting us on a daily basis. So there's so many questions I want to follow up here with now. So how do men begin to start to break this pattern? Because one thing, when I was working, like at one point in my life, I had 2 jobs. I was running a charity, I was a social worker, and I was literally working 24/7, and I completely burnt out. And so I know I've got experience of the kind of, it's quite addictive, that cycle. You've got adrenaline pumping, you've got cortisol going, and then it's actually like keeping you running and going. And how do men interrupt that cycle so they can begin that journey of decreasing the inflammation, decreasing the amount of stress that they're feeling in their bodies, and then opening up space to begin to connect with their bodies in a different way? How do they break that pattern?
I always like to use the word relational, because it's a question of how we relate to everything. So it's our internal world, how we relate to the outside world, how we relate to our partners, different things like that. So it's a very important word for me. Um, so the first question that I would have to ask is, what is their relationship with stress? How do they assimilate it? How do they actually digest it? Is it something that it's very much in the head and in the mind? So they're stressed out to the max in their mind. So they need to, let's say, for instance, do more meditative based exercises to try and sort of decompress and sort of come down to a baseline level again.
Yes.
Um, if we're connecting it with erectile dysfunction or erectile difficulties, that's always associated with breath as well. So what happens if you think about it, when you have a lot of anxiety in the body, what do you do? Or when a person's having a panic attack, most of the time it's breathing very much in the chest. You hold your breath, and it's stopping the circulation in the body. So it's also relearning how to breathe again, and sort of center yourself before you actually engage in these different sexual experiences. Um, One of the things I do speak a lot about is the masturbatory experience. Now, most guys just see it as knocking one off, but in reality, it's also a moment that you can also reflect on what is your biorhythm doing. You know, you have the luxury, or ladies have the luxury of having a menstrual cycle that
Yeah.
kind of indicates to you what is your biorhythm doing every single month. You've
Yes.
probably got a better idea of, hey, this is the time when I know that I'm going to have an increase in my sex drive. I want to connect deeply with that.
Yes.
Or when you're experiencing so much pain that you just go, look, I need to soothe myself. I need to be in me and just receive that love and affection in a different way. Men don't do this. And I think the more aware we become of that cycle for ourselves. So something that I usually do or suggest to people is that why don't you do it's a 3 month graph, because over
Yes.
3 months, you kind of more or less know what your biorhythm is doing, and start noting what is your emotional response on that particular day connected with your arousal response, and see where you are, because it differs. It's always going to be very, very different. And then this also beckons the other question. If you're living with someone, I know women in general do sync in terms of their menstrual cycle, but also the emotional cycle of men does cross over with the partners that they're living with as well. So, all of these little things are very important to sort of ask yourself in terms of where you are in that sort of self-diagnosis.
Oh my gosh, I absolutely love that. Men tracking their own internal biorhythms. And I think it's really important right now because, I follow different of my colleagues, and one colleague was just posting recently. She was asking men, like, men, how are you right now? Your experience matters to us. We want to check in with how you're doing. And men have been responding exhausted, overwhelmed, feel like I've got to support my partner, feel like I need some holding myself, but who is there to listen with me? So, we're at February and we've been in this year-long pandemic, and it's got to people. So it's so interesting what you're saying around supporting men and putting that message out there that men have their own biorhythm, because I think we can all have a tendency to just get on with things and just think, oh well, that's what's going on, and I should just be able to connect with my body or be with my partner just as usual. But what you're saying is really that, like, men can take a step back and think, well, actually, I've had a really stressful week at work this week,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm feeling low this week,
Mm-hmm.
or I'm feeling really joyful, and then tracking how that relates to, and can you give an example, because you said so they track the emotions and then their
So,
arousal.
so basically, on a very basic curve, I would do it over 30 days, and I would sort of rate it 0 to 10. 10 being feeling absolutely optimum, really
Yes.
deeply connected with your sexuality, wanting to express and engage, and also try and check where you are emotionally in that as well. Because if you can start noting that actually sex is about connection and depth, and wanting to express something different, that it's not just about the discharge of I need to get stress out of the body. Your orgasm becomes more of a natural type of orgasm rather than one that is almost forced, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And I think this applies to both men and women. And
Yeah.
if you I'm glad that you said about this whole pandemic idea, because something that's been very interesting for me to note is you have a lot of couples that are now forced together, that have to stay together 24/7,
Yes.
in comparison to before, where it would be like sort of 70/30. 70% you're out of home and at work and things like that, and that
Yes.
30% is where you can sort of come and meld together. And I think that in itself positions the couple to be very stressed, because how do you renegotiate what is your natural sexual rhythm? Look, if I get given it to me, as often as you wanted, that's my ideal. But then if I'm also very honest with myself, with my biorhythm, there's also been moments where I go, look, I love you very much. And this is a question I do ask my partner. And I would probably say, do you want the fullness of me in the presence of the experience with you in our sexual encounter?
Yes.
Or do you want to feel me distant? Because the reality is that if I'm very stressed and I'm refocusing or focusing on something else, I'm not going to be 100% present. And I also have to voice that.
Oh,
And I think that also takes a lot of courage for guys, because it's
yes.
like you were saying about the guys that they don't know who to actually sit with that emotion that they're putting out there. This is essential, and we have to learn how to do this.
Oh my gosh, that is beautiful. So it's about the mindset. How are you approaching? What is your internal state of mind and body? And is that the kind of optimal way to connect with your partner? And it's actually consciously choosing, is now the time I'm going to have sex with my partner? I love what you shared with your partner and how you broached that.
The same thing needs to be said with masturbation as well, because
Yes.
it's like, if we're I mean, we get conditioned very quickly. If something feels good, we go, okay, that's our go-to. We know that it feels good.
Yes.
um so if there's that sort of repertoire of going, okay, come home from work, what do I do? Put on Pornhub, put on whatever I'm watching, and you give yourself that 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever it is. I don't think that you're also acknowledging yourself in terms of how you're really feeling there. And is it an act of self-love as well? Because a lot of men don't see masturbation as self-love. Women see masturbation as self-love, or at least
Yeah.
they're reaching that point. Um, and so I think what in my head, what eventually is going to happen is that more men are going to become more conscious of not only what masturbation means to them and the narrative behind that,
Yes.
um, but also in like you're bringing to the table here about stress. We need to change the narrative. How do we digest that? How do we see it differently? How do we use it as more of a flag, raising it up to us and going, hey, look, you're not looking after yourself if you're stressed like this. You need to make some changes.
Oh my gosh, but that's so hard. It's so hard to break that pattern. I know for myself personally, and the men that I'm still working with currently,
Hmm.
it's a hard pattern to break because it's such a self-fulfilling, like I said earlier, pattern. And I love what you're saying as well about stress and the different approaches. Do men need something that's a bit more self-soothing? Or do they need something that's a bit
It's
more discharging,
it's
where
it's
they're
it's a very
releasing it?
it's a very, very, very good question. If I reflect on myself, one thing, I ride motorbikes as an example, and that for me, I guess for me, is my meditation. It's meditation in motion. Whereas
Ooh,
I'll put my helmet on, and it's
yes.
a moment that I have to be 100% present and conscious with myself, because if I'm not, I'm more than likely going to have an accident. So the kind of the death factor does sort of put you more in yourself, and it gives me that chance of just sort of just feeling those emotions. And I guess the most pivotal moments in my life where I've had to really make decisions on let's say, for instance, a partner, ending a relationship that I was in that wasn't working for me. I took a motorbike journey. I went from London all the way to Switzerland, and then all the way to Romania. And that time of being able to sit with yourself and digest and surrender and connect, I think, is essential. I think that can be transferred across the board to anything. It's just more of a question of, what is the felt sense that that person needs. I think men are more than likely more attuned to go for something more aggressive.
Yes.
Boxing, martial arts, some kind of sport that gets that discharge out.
Yes.
Um, but I do question, is that nurturing? And this is where I think we fall short.
Yes. And what I love about my work with men is that I'm a woman. So I love that I'm able to bring more of that message of nurturing. And a man who I was working with recently, I recommended him to get a shoulder massage from his partner and to get some nurturing, because I agree, like there is maybe the go-to is something more aggressive to discharge, and that really does have its place for all of us, not just men. And so what I'm thinking in my head is, how can men know, okay, is this a helpful form of stress release for me? And what I'm thinking is to track how they feel afterwards, and maybe if there's a hangover the next day, do they feel rejuvenated? Do they feel energized? Do they feel like it's actually the stress has left their system? Are they feeling better?
I think for me, it's a question of distraction versus presence.
Yeah,
So it's like if I go do boxing and I get into a ring for 12 rounds, yes, it's going to be discharging a lot, I think, on a physical level, but
yeah.
then I'm also thinking about it from a different perspective as well. So if I have a lot of cortisol in my body, I'm already stressed. Now I'm smashing it in my workout. Yes, in theory, the exercise is good, but you're also releasing adrenaline and all these different things that are increasing your inflammation in the body again. So you're doubling the amount of stress that you're actually creating. Um, there has to be a balance with something like that. And when you're bringing it more into the sort of nurturing realm, one thing that I do find is very, very helpful is actually being able to share in a masculine space.
Mm,
Men aren't used to this traditionally.
no.
And so I always urge everybody, try and find a men's group, try and try
Yes,
and
I
and
do
the
too.
beautiful and the beautiful thing about that is that when they do enter it, it's look, you can have the alpha, you can have whatever you want to name them, all the way to the other end of the spectrum,
Yes,
but that sharing of that masculinity and that masculine space, and it removes the toxicity straight away. And that's also something that we need to sort of get our heads around, because if you really think about it, unless you've had a very, very solid male structure in your life that teaches you how to love like a man
yes.
and the love of a man, then you'll know how to love yourself and give that love as a man.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. It's so true. I feel that with the women's work. I've learnt so much from being in all female spaces, observing how the women are loving themselves and role modeling in that, and then absorbing that and teaching myself it. It's so true. We need role models. We need role models.
Absolutely.
So just to kind of bring it back to, this is not that we went off track. What you're sharing is so helpful. We're supporting, you're supporting and sharing with men, kind of just summarizing at the moment, different ways to discharge stress and different ways to release tension and stress in the body. And why we're sharing this, for people who are tuned in, for people who are watching this, and people who are men who are listening, is then it's supporting you to connect with your body, be in a more calm state in your body, which will free you up for more connection with yourself, more arousal, more desire, and more connection. Because stress actually makes us not present. It leads us to not be present. And presence is how we connect with ourselves, and for men with their partners.
I think one of the biggest flaws, I think, in the masculine mindset is, how do I put this? Defensiveness, I think, would be the word that I would use, because when you usually present men with breath work, meditation, yoga, something that is not the norm for them, there is
Yes.
always the defensive. There's some kind of defensiveness there. Another thing is dance, as an example. So if you look at a lot of women's groups, what is the one thing that is present in most women's groups? It's dance.
Yes.
It's that absolute liberation. And you look at your training as well. I know Layla does a lot of dance in that,
Yes.
um, which is amazing. And I just don't think that enough men do that either, which is very interesting. So it's like when I work with a lot of couples, one of the first things I say to them is go dance, go learn how to dance.
Yes.
And the immediate thing that you see in the guy is, there's some kind of defensiveness and resistance there. That in itself is going to make you face up to all these things. It's fluidity. It's trying to connect with
Oh,
with
yes.
really an essence of not only feeling yourself and feeling a rhythm in yourself, and we all have rhythm if we want to,
Yeah.
but it's also the rhythm of the other and feeling the other. And that's always transferable into the bedroom as well, because that's really what it's about. It's about that felt sense of being with that other.
Oh, that's beautiful. And yeah, dance has been a massive part of my life. So I can really relate to how it opens up doorways and connection and intimacy.
Mm.
So for the men who are listening, they've found some kind of active meditation. They've found some kind of way of de-stressing their body,
Mhm.
reducing inflammation, reducing the levels of cortisol that works for them. And what would be the next step to reconnect with their sexuality and their partners?
I think it's a question of prioritization. This is also
Yes.
something that's
Oof.
also very important
Yeah.
because don't take me wrong, I think most men are very career driven, so they're going to go down that path, and for them it's about achievement, and it's about being in the masculine, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with
Yes.
that. But there's going to come a particular point where you are going to meet someone. They are going to have expectations. um, it's it's going to be something that you're going to have to reattune yourself to their needs. What are your needs? What are the expectations? How do you put that out there? There's a lot of things that you need to ask there.
Yes. And so for men, reconnecting with their sexuality as well. So another thing also I wanted to say is that what I've noticed with the men that I work with is they have stopped having intimacy in the relationship.
Mhm.
They've stopped masturbating. And then it gets to a point where it's like a self-fulfilling like
Mhm.
prophecy where they've had an experience. So I put it out there before this for any men to kind of share. And one man shared that he's been under a lot of stress with the pandemic and he's not been having erections and he was really shamed by the woman for not having erections. So then what happens with men is that they are, well, I'm not going there, then I'm just gonna
They shut themselves
I
down.
shut yeah, understandably, because it's for men it's a sense of their body's not working, it's a
Yeah.
sense of failure, shame, and shame is like one of the worst emotions ever to feel. So I get it. And so we'll kind of just finish up on this. Just I really wanted to touch on this for any
Mm.
men who are watching, how they can begin to support themselves to break this cycle and reconnect with their penis, with their sex drive, their arousal in a positive way.
I mean, what's really interesting about your question is last night I was in a talk with quite an interesting eclectic mix of people, and it was really about tips of how to maintain erection, all those kind of things. And one of the guys was sharing, which was really, really interesting. And um, a lot of guys do experience this at some point. And it's, you lose erection, you could be stressed, there could be a lot of different factors, but it's more of a question of how you relate to that. Because if you think about this whole idea of pleasure principle, we connect pleasure with orgasm,
Yes,
and we forget the whole sort of transition, the transitory experience getting to that particular point, and it's not really necessarily about the orgasm. But from a man's perspective, it means that I have to be hard in order to help that person get to that point.
yes,
And I think also something that, and what was really interesting is that I made this comment last night, and I said, but hold on a second, it doesn't necessarily matter if you lose your erection. It's the question of what you do with the loss of erection thereafter.
yes,
Are you stimulating her with a flaccid wand, or is she taking it and enjoying it in the same process? And this is where I think there's a huge responsibility on women as well to recognize that men will experience something like this, and it doesn't mean that this is a reflection on you, that they are not attracted to you, that there's something wrong with you, this is why they're not aroused. So I think that internal dialogue also needs to sort of be parked and bring the feminine into the present and actually go, hey, hold on a second, don't worry. Let's take a breather, let's kiss, let's sort of retract from the penetration. Let me hold your wand and stimulate myself.
yes,
And the response, which I found fascinating, was you had 50% of the woman going, yes, that's amazing. And then you had 50% of the other woman going, no, I want it hard. So I guess the reason
Wow.
why I'm bringing this up is that I think we also need to have a degree of conscientiousness and care and love towards our partner.
Yes.
We're not machines. Nor can we expect our partner to be, hey, I want to have sex with you right now. If I have a very high
Yeah.
sex drive, this is where I think it's about beautiful communication. Um, both sides need to work on something like this, and I think if you're experiencing a lot of shame, that says a lot about what you need to work on, because shame for me is always about self-loathing.
Yes.
If you're loathing yourself, that's connected to something different. If you've managed to connect that with your sex and your sexuality and being able to discharge that side of yourself, you need to do work on that,
Yes.
because that's only going to compound and get worse and worse and worse. um
Oh, yes. I kind of did like, I was shocked. 50% said, no, I need it hard. But actually,
yeah.
I'm not shocked. I can see why. And this opens up a whole nother conversation around responsibility for our sexual turn on and
Mhm.
how we orgasm and how we experience pleasure. And I just, oh gosh, I just feel like those men out there who are feeling pressured who can feel that pressure to be hard. And I love how you're saying that it takes two. This is a conversation that we all need to be having and need to be bringing in that kind of, I don't even know if it's compassion, because compassion kind of suggests that there's something wrong with someone going soft. There isn't.
I
Men
think
aren't machines.
I think the word that I would probably use is that it's it's a sensation. And what I mean by that is that being erect is a completely different sensation to being aroused and flaccid. The arousal response is still there. It's still that desire of wanting to engage sexually. And I just think that the mistake comes in when we go, flaccid means I'm not aroused, I'm not connected, I don't want to have sex. And
Yes.
and if a man can stay in that space where he's accepting of that and he's present with that, and equally his partner being with him in that, what's naturally going to happen? He's going to get aroused again. That cycle
Yes.
is going to pick up again. He's going to feel the sensations through the flaccidness, which is eventually going to lead to the hardness again.
Yes. So for everyone listening and the men listening, what I'm hearing from what you're saying, Massimo, which is just so brilliant, is you've done your active meditation, you've released the stress. Now, how do you reconnect with your sexuality, and how do you respond to your body's natural response, which is hard, soft, hard, soft. It's totally natural. It is not an indication of a problem, is to be okay. So kind of an acceptance with it and making the choice, let's share something else now. And the partners, that are having sex or even in self-pleasure, making a choice to be with the softness, play with the softness, and then in that acceptance and removing and letting go of the pressure and the expectation to get hard quickly and as soon as possible, that actually paradoxically in the acceptance and the kind of self-love really of releasing yourself of that pressure, that arousal will come again, the hardness will come again.
And no pun intended on the coming again as well.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So I'm going to bring this conversation to an end. And thank you so much, Massimo, for joining me in this conversation. And I've actually approached you because there's so many things that have come out of this. And one of the things is, because I think this deserves a lot more time, attention, and a whole new conversation, is supporting men around and women around how do you play with non-erect penises in self-pleasure and intimacy. So that's something I think we're going to potentially be having a conversation around another time. So thank you. Thank you everyone so much for listening. And if you are wanting the support, this is, I have space right now. This is the kind of support that I offer, and I work with men. And the same with Massimo.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you offer this type of support for men as well. So thank you very much for listening.